Ladies and gentlemen, let's stop pretending. Let's stop sugarcoating. Let's stop dancing around the truth like it's some delicate piece of glass that might shatter if we so much as speak out loud. Because the truth is this: World War III might not be coming. It might already be here. No, there are no declarations, no formal alliances marching down the streets waving flags, and no Churchillian radio broadcast echoing through wartime silence. But look around. Chaos is erupting across the globe. Blood is being spilled. Power is shifting. And the world order is convulsing. This isn't a battlefield of trenches and tanks anymore. This is economic warfare, cyber warfare, information warfare. And yes, bombs are still dropping. People are still dying. Civilians are still paying the price for decisions made in cold rooms by powerful men who sleep just fine while the rest of us watch the world burn on our phones. Russia didn't invade Ukraine. It ignited a new era of modern conflict. Let's stop treating it like some regional skirmish. NATO's weapons are in play, sanctions are crippling economies, and every inch of Ukrainian soil has become a symbol in a far bigger struggle, a proxy war between empires old and new. Modern warfare has evolved far beyond the images we hold from history books or black and white documentaries. Gone are the days when conflict was defined solely by tanks rolling across borders, battleships anchored off foreign coasts, or soldiers in trenches exchanging gunfire. Today, war is not declared on the front page of a newspaper. It doesn't wait for a formal statement from a president or a general. It creeps into our lives silently, dressed in the language of economics, data breaches, proxy aggression, and psychological manipulation. It exists without needing to be named, and that is exactly why it's more dangerous than ever. This shift in the nature of war means we're no longer facing one single enemy with a recognizable uniform or a visible flag. Instead, we're dealing with a fragmented, multipolar battlefield where conflicts are spread across continents and fought using tools that don't look like weapons. The battlefield is now digital, economic, ideological. Enemies don't just target cities, they target minds, systems, currencies, and cultures. And most of the time, we don't even realize it's happening. Cyber attacks have become the new bombs. A country can be brought to its knees not by an invasion, but by a coordinated shutdown of its power grids, its banks, its communication systems. No missiles required, just lines of code and a laptop. And while the world watches the skies for planes, entire economies are being hacked from basements and bunkers across the globe. It's not hypothetical. It's not science fiction. It's real. From ransomware attacks on hospitals to cyber intrusions into election systems, nations are under siege every single day. Economic warfare is another silent weapon reshaping the modern war zone. Sanctions are used like guided missiles, targeting key sectors of national economies. They're sold to the public as peaceful alternatives to combat, but their impact can be just as destructive. They can create poverty, collapse healthcare systems, and crush local industries. Whole populations suffer, even starve, without a single bullet fired. It's a war tactic cloaked in diplomacy. We call it leverage, but it's a form of siege. Then there's the information war, the most pervasive and underestimated front of all. In this era, truth itself is a battleground. Deep fakes, fake news, algorithmic manipulation, and state-sponsored propaganda are creating entire realities that serve national agendas. Armies of bots and trolls don't just push opinions, they shape elections, polarize societies, and turn neighbor against neighbor. It's not just about lies, it's about destroying trust in media, in governments, in each other. A divided society is a weakened nation, and that's exactly what these information campaigns are designed to do. Drones, once tools of surveillance, are now deadly precise instruments of remote warfare. They hover over regions far from our headlines, dropping death from the sky without warning, operated by someone sitting safely thousands of miles away. This form of warfare eliminates the need for soldiers on the ground, removing the human face of war and replacing it with a joystick and a screen. It's sanitized violence, depersonalized and efficient, making it easier than ever for leaders to authorize strikes without public backlash. Proxy wars are another defining trait of this new era. Rather than fighting directly, powerful nations now fund, arm, and support local factions to do their bidding. Syria, Yemen, Libya. These are not isolated civil wars. They are theaters in which global powers settle their scores by proxy. The people caught in the crossfire are seen not as human beings, but as geopolitical leverage. This method allows major players to keep their hands clean while keeping the world in chaos. This is what war looks like now. It is borderless, shapeless, and often silent. It doesn't always come with air raid sirens or press conferences. Sometimes it's a supply chain disruption. Sometimes it's a sudden market crash. Sometimes It's a well-placed rumor that topples a government. We keep waiting for the next world war to start. But what if it already has? What if the opening shots were fired years ago, digitally, economically, politically, and we just didn't recognize them because they didn't look like the wars we were taught to fear? The absence of bombs doesn't mean the absence of war. The absence of a battlefield doesn't mean the absence of a fight. And the absence of headlines doesn't mean the world isn't burning. It just means we're being outmaneuvered, outpaced, and outwitted by a new form of conflict we refuse to acknowledge because it doesn't fit neatly into our outdated definitions. That refusal to adapt could be our greatest vulnerability, and it may already be costing us more than we realize. The situation in the Middle East has long been a source of global tension, but what we are witnessing now is not just another cycle of violence. It is something far more volatile, far more interconnected, and far more dangerous. The current standoff between Iran and Israel is not an isolated regional affair. It is a high-stakes confrontation with global implications, and it is taking place on a geopolitical fault line so sensitive that a single miscalculation could ignite a chain reaction with devastating consequences for the entire world. Yet the world continues to watch, comment, and calculate as if this is just another chapter in a long book of unrest, rather than the spark that could light the next global fire. Iran is not merely a regional actor, it is a strategic player with ideological ambition, military reach, and a deep-rooted network of influence stretching across Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. Its support for militant groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthi rebels is not accidental. It is deliberate, calculated, and often deadly. It allows Iran to project power indirectly while avoiding full-scale confrontations. These groups serve as proxies, armed and guided to challenge Israel and destabilize countries aligned with the West. Meanwhile, Iran's nuclear ambitions remain a shadow hanging over the entire region, an unresolved threat that continues to build despite sanctions, diplomacy, and international pressure. On the other side, Israel stands as both a fortress and a flashpoint. It possesses advanced military capabilities, intelligence dominance, and nuclear weapons that it neither confirms nor denies. It is a nation that has endured decades of conflict, surrounded by enemies and driven by a survival instinct that fuels rapid, often preemptive, military action. Israel sees Iran not just as a rival but as an existential threat, a state whose leadership has publicly questioned its right to exist. This deep animosity is not theoretical. It is woven into both countries' defense strategies, into their national narratives, and into the daily decisions of their governments. The frequency and intensity of direct and indirect clashes between these two powers have been escalating. Covert operations, assassinations, drone strikes, cyber attacks, and retaliatory bombings are occurring with increasing regularity. Iranian military advisors are killed in Syria. Israeli embassies come under threat. Iran's nuclear scientists are targeted in mysterious circumstances. These are not mere diplomatic disagreements. They are acts of war playing out under a veil of ambiguity. And each new attack invites the risk of escalation of an open conflict that could drag the entire region and potentially the world into its wake. Complicating matters further is the involvement of global powers. The United States has historically backed Israel both militarily and politically, providing billions in aid and acting as its most powerful diplomatic shield. Russia and China, on the other hand, have increasingly sided with Iran, either openly or through quiet cooperation. Every move in this conflict is being watched and interpreted by these larger nations, each of which has its own stake in the outcome. A regional conflict involving Israel and Iran doesn't stay regional for long. It becomes a proxy battleground for global rivalry. The Middle East is already saturated with conflict zones, fragile governments, and displaced populations. Adding a full-scale Iran-Israel war to the equation could collapse the remaining structures of stability. Oil prices would skyrocket, triggering economic shocks worldwide. Refugee flows would increase, extremist groups would exploit the chaos, shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf could be blocked, igniting maritime conflict. And the potential for nuclear escalation, however remote, cannot be dismissed when both sides are under pressure and backed into corners. Iran and Israel are locked in a dangerous cycle of provocation and response, where restraint is weakening and red lines are becoming blurred. The problem is not just what these two nations are doing to each other, it is what their conflict is doing to the region, to the global economy, to diplomacy, and to the idea of peace as a viable option. With each new confrontation, with each new casualty, the risk grows that someone, somewhere, will push too far. International responses have so far been limited to condemnation, back-channel negotiations, and fragile ceasefires. But these are not solutions. They are temporary pauses in a slow, burning escalation that continues to move forward. The world cannot afford to treat this conflict as business as usual. It has the potential to go from a regional flashpoint to a global inferno in the space of a single night, through one missile strike, one retaliatory action, or one misinterpreted movement. This is not just a diplomatic challenge, it is a global security crisis in waiting. Unfolding in plain sight, China is no longer quietly rising. It is actively redefining global power on its own terms, with a strategy that is as disciplined as it is expansive. Unlike the loud and often chaotic tactics used by other powers, China's approach to global dominance is subtle, patient, and ruthlessly calculated. It is not relying on traditional warfare to assert its influence. Instead, it is operating on multiple fronts, economically, technologically, diplomatically, and militarily, while the rest of the world underestimates just how far ahead its game plan really is. This isn't just a regional superpower asserting control over its neighborhood. This is a global player building a new world order, brick by brick, deal by deal, and base by base. One of the clearest examples of China's ambitions lies in its military expansion. The Chinese military, known as the People's Liberation Army, has undergone a massive modernization drive. It now possesses some of the most advanced missile systems, naval capabilities, and cyber warfare tools on the planet. It is constructing artificial islands in the South China Sea and militarizing them despite international objections. These islands are not just land grabs, they are floating fortresses meant to project power and control critical trade routes that see trillions of dollars in goods pass through every year. When China builds a runway on a reef or a radar dome on a pile of sand, it is not just about defending territory. It is about signaling to the world that this sea, this space, this future belongs to Beijing. Taiwan is perhaps the most sensitive pressure point in China's strategy. Beijing sees it as a breakaway province, but to much of the world, it is a thriving democracy, a critical player in the global semiconductor industry, and a symbol of resistance to authoritarian expansion. The threat of invasion is not theoretical. China has repeatedly sent warplanes into Taiwan's air defense zone, conducted military drills around the island, and issued thinly veiled warnings to any nation that dares to support its independence. This isn't a bluff, it's a dress rehearsal. And if China moves on Taiwan, it could trigger a military response from the United States and its allies, unleashing a conflict that would reverberate far beyond Asia. But China's aggression isn't limited to military maneuvers. Its economic strategies are just as powerful and far more insidious. The Belt and Road Initiative, spanning over 140 countries, is one of the largest infrastructure and investment programs ever undertaken. On the surface, it promises development and prosperity to struggling nations, but beneath that promise lies a strategic trap. Through debt diplomacy, China gains control of ports, railroads, and energy infrastructure in critical regions. When nations fail to repay their debts, China tightens its grip, turning investments into leverage. It is a form of modern conquest, not with armies, but with loans and contracts, and it is working. Technologically, China is making equally alarming strides. It leads the world in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, facial recognition, and surveillance technology. It is exporting these technologies to authoritarian regimes, helping them tighten control over their own populations, while also expanding China's digital reach. Chinese tech giants like Huawei and TikTok are under scrutiny, not just for market competition, but for the potential backdoors they may offer to the Chinese state. This is not paranoia, it's preparation. The next world war may not be fought on battlefields, but in data centers, in satellites, in hacked servers, and China is preparing for that future. While China expands its influence, it also engages in aggressive diplomacy designed to silence criticism and isolate its adversaries. Through trade threats, media manipulation, and political pressure, it punishes countries that speak out on issues like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, or the South China Sea. It uses its position in institutions like the United Nations to reshape global norms, shifting the balance away from Western ideals of freedom and transparency toward a model built on surveillance, control, and state supremacy. And while all this is happening, the world is distracted. The West is embroiled in cultural battles, political dysfunction, and economic uncertainty. Leaders are more focused on short-term elections than long-term strategy. Meanwhile, China plays the long game, unmoved by political turnover or public opinion. It doesn't need to win over its population. It just needs to outlast and outmaneuver its rivals. Every policy, every agreement, every statement is part of a broader plan that spans decades, not news cycles. China's actions may not be as overt as launching missiles or occupying foreign capitals, But make no mistake, this is a form of warfare. It is cold, quiet, and strategic, and it is reshaping the world without firing a shot. The world may not be at war with China today in the conventional sense, but the competition is no less real, and the consequences of ignoring it could be catastrophic. The Western world, once the unquestioned epicenter of global leadership, now appears increasingly distracted, divided, and dangerously naive in the face of growing global threats, while rival powers solidify their positions, expand their influence, and prepare for long-term geopolitical shifts. Many Western nations are trapped in short-term thinking, internal squabbles, and a dangerous sense of complacency. The very institutions and alliances that were designed to ensure global stability are being eroded from within, not by foreign adversaries with tanks and missiles, but by domestic dysfunction, cultural infighting, and a lack of strategic clarity. The West isn't losing power because it's being overtaken. It's losing power because it's surrendering focus. The United States, still the most powerful military and economic force on the planet, is increasingly consumed by internal division. Political discourse has become toxic, partisan gridlock is the norm, and trust in institutions is collapsing. Every election brings more volatility, more finger-pointing, and less willingness to unify around long-term national interests. Instead of preparing for the shifting tides of global power, America spends much of its energy battling itself. Policy reversals every 4 years make it difficult to maintain any coherent foreign strategy, while adversaries like China and Russia operate with consistency and long-term vision. In an era where patience and planning define success, the West is reacting to headlines while others are writing the script. Across Europe, the situation isn't much better. Brexit fractured the unity of the European Union, exposing the vulnerabilities of a continent that prides itself on integration. Member states are increasingly pulling in different directions on issues ranging from immigration to defense. Economic pressures, rising nationalism, and social unrest have made cohesive action difficult. While NATO remains a vital alliance, its internal cohesion is being tested. Disagreements over defense spending, strategic priorities, and even basic principles have weakened the alliance's deterrent posture. Europe has the capacity to be a global force, but its internal distractions have rendered it hesitant and often reactive. While the West debates pronouns, flags, and statues, its adversaries are building warships, cyber arsenals, and surveillance states. Cultural conflicts, though important in their own context, have consumed the political space once reserved for diplomacy, security, and economic vision. The obsession with optics over outcomes has hollowed out the kind of leadership that's required in times of crisis. Social media outrage cycles drive public discourse, and leaders cater to applause rather than act on hard truths. This climate rewards performance, not policy theatrics, not strategy. And in doing so, it leaves the West vulnerable to those who are quietly, methodically preparing to take its place. Defense spending across many Western countries is inconsistent and often politically contentious. While some nations have made increases in response to the war in Ukraine, others continue to rely on outdated systems, underfunded forces, and vague promises. The belief that peace is permanent has lulled large parts of the West into a false sense of security. The reality is that military strength still matters, and without it, diplomacy is just words. Countries like Russia, China, and Iran understand this. They operate from a position of strength and are not afraid to use it. The West, on the other hand, continues to underestimate the threat of force used with purpose. The failure to take global threats seriously is not just about budgets or policies, it's about mindset. There is a widespread belief in many Western capitals that history moves in one direction, that progress is inevitable, and that liberal democracy will always prevail. This is not just naivete, it is dangerous. The world is not a classroom experiment in equality and fairness. It is a competitive, often brutal arena where power is earned, defended, and contested. Believing otherwise opens the door to those who have no interest in playing by the rules. Diplomatic softness has become another weakness. In an effort to avoid confrontation, many Western leaders have adopted a language of endless compromise, believing that dialogue alone can solve any problem. But not every adversary wants peace, some want dominance. And when met with weakness, they push harder. The idea that every problem has a diplomatic solution ignores the reality that power is often the deciding factor in global affairs. Moral lectures from the podium don't mean much when faced with tanks on the ground or cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. The West still has the resources, talent, and global influence to shape the future, but it cannot do so if it remains consumed by its own reflection. Strength requires unity, clarity, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Without that, even the most powerful nations will find themselves caught off guard, reacting too late to threats they should have seen coming. The world is changing, and the West cannot afford to be distracted while others write the next chapter of global power. The idea that World War III would begin with a dramatic declaration or a sudden, unmistakable event is outdated and misleading. In reality, global conflict in the 21st century is unlikely to arrive as a single, unified explosion of violence. Instead, it is unfolding in fragments across different regions, through different means, and with different players. The war is not coming, it is happening already, but in pieces. It is taking place in the shadows of familiar wars, within economic battles, through proxy conflicts, cyber warfare, and relentless propaganda. It is a war without a name, fought without uniformed armies marching in lines, but its impact is no less real or threatening. Look at the map and connect the dots. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not a local power play. It's a direct challenge to the West and its post-Cold War dominance. It has triggered an arms race in Europe, drawn in NATO resources and destabilized global energy and food supplies. Across the Middle East, the Israel-Iran standoff is escalating into a broader regional conflict with global implications. Meanwhile, tensions in the Taiwan Strait continue to rise as China inches closer to asserting control over what it claims as its own territory, challenging US influence in the Pacific and threatening global supply chains, particularly in semiconductors. These flashpoints are not isolated incidents. They are pressure points in a system that is straining under the weight of competition, mistrust, and geopolitical ambition. Every action in one part of the world has a ripple effect in another. Weapons sent to Ukraine anger Russia. Alliances formed in the Indo-Pacific alarm China. Oil sanctions on Iran deepen its ties with Russia and China. The world is becoming polarized into opposing camps, much like it did before the two previous world wars. And just like then, we may only recognize the scale of what's happening when it is far too late. Modern warfare does not need to be continuous to be devastating. Conflicts can simmer for years, flare up suddenly, and then retreat into tension without resolution. But that doesn't mean they aren't part of a larger war. Just because there isn't a coordinated global battlefield doesn't mean there isn't a global battle. Today's war is being fought in cyber attacks that paralyze governments, in drone strikes that assassinate military leaders, in economic sanctions that cripple economies, and in online narratives that divide populations. This is warfare redesigned for the digital age, diffuse, relentless, and designed to wear down rather than wipe out. The weapons of World War III are not only bombs and bullets. They are trade restrictions, information manipulation, data theft, disinformation campaigns, and psychological operations. Social media platforms are battlegrounds. Bank accounts are targeted like airbases. Elections are influenced without a single soldier crossing a border. Infrastructure is attacked without an army even being present. Hospitals, energy grids, water supplies. These are the new targets, and they are being hit every day somewhere in the world. The damage may not be as visibly dramatic as a battlefield explosion, but the long-term effects are equally destructive. Economic warfare has become a dominant form of global conflict. Sanctions, tariffs, embargoes, and financial blacklisting are used not only to punish governments, but to pressure entire populations. These tools may be presented as peaceful alternatives to violence, but they are acts of war in every sense. They starve economies, provoke unrest, and push nations into alliances of survival. Russia, China, Iran, and others are already forming economic and military networks to counter Western dominance, creating a parallel world order with its own rules, institutions, and currencies. The decoupling of the global economy is already underway, and with it, the stage is being set for deeper conflict. Proxy wars are also a defining feature of this fragmented global war. Nations no longer need to engage directly when they can arm and support others to do their fighting for them. Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Sudan are all battlegrounds for larger powers vying for control and influence. These are not civil wars in the traditional sense. They are extensions of a global struggle for dominance, played out through local actors who bear the brunt of foreign ambition. The people dying on these battlefields are casualties of a much larger hidden war. The absence of a single unifying war front has made it easier for the world to ignore the reality of what's happening. There's no formal start date, no treaty violations that make headlines globally, no unified enemy. But the warning signs are everywhere. The alliances are forming, the weapons are stockpiling. The rhetoric is hardening, and the lines are being drawn. The most dangerous part is that much of the world still believes it's at peace, while the architecture of war is being built around it. That blindness is not just Na'vi, It is deadly. The next world war won't announce itself. It's already speaking in whispers across continents.